So in this video, let's see about two-port network parameters. Two-port networks can be used to represent any complex electrical network into a simple equivalent model. The electrical component like transmission lines and transformers can be modeled into two-port network models. Similarly, electronic components like transistors and op-amps can be modeled into two-port network models. The article gives an overview of two-port network parameters and how to calculate them. In this article, we also provided the condition for symmetry and reciprocal for the given network concerning two-port network parameter. These conditions will help check the given network whether it is symmetrical or not, and similarly reciprocal or not. Two-port network. In two-port network, we can give the input into any port. Similarly, we can take the output from any port. Since we have two electrical quantities, voltage and current, obviously the input and the output will be among these two forms. The parameters will be used in two-port network are known as two-port network parameters, in such that there are four variables V1, V2, I1, I2. We will get six set of parameters for the two-port network. Now let's see about two-port network parameters: Z parameters, Y parameters, H parameters, and ABCE parameters. Z parameters. Among the four variables V1, V2, I1, I2, and I of these two-port network, let's consider I1 and I2 are independent variables and V1 and V2 are dependent variables. That means I1 and I2 are the inputs, where V1 and V2 are the outputs of the two-port network. The two-port equations of these two-port network and the corresponding Z parameters are mentioned below. V1 is equals to Z1 I1 plus ZI1 plus ZI2. V2 is equals to Z2 I1 plus Z2 I2. Z11 is equals to V1 by I1 is equal when I2 is equals to 0. Z12 is equals to V1 by I2 when I1 is equals to 0, and Z1 is 12 is equals to V2 by I1 when I2 is equals to 0, and Z22 is equals to V2 by I2 when I1 is equals to 0. Z parameters. Here's the ratio of output voltage and input current gives the values of impedance and the inputs units or ohms. Since the two-port network parameters are called impedance parameters as Z parameters, we can find two parameters Z11 and Z21 by making port 2 and open circuit. Similarly, we can see the orders Z parameters Z12 and Z22 by making port 1 and open circuit. Hence, we can call Z parameters as open circuit impedance parameters. Our two-port network is said to be a symmetrical network of Z11 is equals to Z22. A two-port network is said to be reciprocal of Z12 is equals to Z21. Next, let's see about Y parameters. Among four variables V1, V2, I1, I2 of these two-port network, let's consider V1 and V2 are independent variables and I1 and I2 are dependent variables. That means V1 and V2 are the inputs and I1 and I2 are the outputs of these two network parameters. The two equations of the two-port network and the corresponding Y parameters are mentioned below. I1 is equals to Y1 V1 plus 1 y of 1 2 and V2. I2 is equals to Y2 I2 by plus Y22 V2. Y11 is equals to I1 by V1 when V2 is equals to 0. Y12 is equals to I1 by V2 when V1 is equals to 0. Y21 is equals to Y2 I2 by V1 when V2 is equals to 0, and Y22 is equals to I2 by V2 when V1 2 is equals to 0. So here is the ratio of output current and input voltage gives the value of impedance, admittance, and the units of ohm. Hence, the two-port network parameters are called admittance parameters or Y parameters. We can find two Y parameters, Y11 and Y21, by making a port 2 a short circuit. Similarly, we can see the other two Y parameters, Y12 and Y22, by making port 1 a short course. Hence, we can call Y parameter short circuit admittance parameters. A two-port network is said to be symmetrical network. Y11 is equals to Y22. A two-port network can be a reciprocal of if Y12 is equals to Y21. H parameters among the four variables y, v1, v2, i1 and i2 of two-port network. Let's consider i1 and v2 as independent variables and v1 and i2 as dependent variables. That means i1 and v2 are the inputs, whereas v1 and i2 are the outputs of the two-port network. The two equations of two-port network and the corresponding in parameters are mentioned below. v1 is equals to h1 i1 plus I1 h of 1 2 V2. I2 is equals to h of 2 1 I1 plus h of 2 2 V2. H of 1 1 is equals to V1 by I1 when V2 is equals to 0. H12 is equals to V1 by V2 when I1 is equals to 0. H21 is equals to I2 by I1 when V2 is equals to 0. H of 2 2 is equals to I2 by V2 when I1 is equals to 0. Here H12 and H21 do not have any units. The units of H11 and H22 are ohms and ohm respectively. The H parameters is also called hybrid parameters. We can find two H parameters, H11 and H21, by making port 2 a short circuit. Similarly, we can see the two other H parameters, H12 and H22, by making port 1 an open circuit. A two-port network is said to be a symmetrical network if H1 such that H1 and H22 minus H21 and H21 is equals to 1. A two-port network is said to be a reciprocal of H12 is equals to minus of H21. Next, let's see about ABCD parameters. ABCD parameters is also known as T parameters. Among the four variables V1, V2 and I1, I2 of the two-port network, let's consider V1 and I1 as the independent variables and V2 and I2 are dependent variables. That means V1 and I1 are the input, whereas V2 and I2 are the outputs of the two-port network. The two equations of this part are T equal parameters are mentioned below. Here A and D are not having any units, where units of B and D are ohms and ohms respectively. A, B, C, D parameters are also known as inverse transmission parameters or T parameters in short. We can find two T parameters A and C by making port I an open circuit. Similarly, we can see the other two T parameters B and D by making port I a short course. A two-port network is said to be asymmetrical if A is equals to D. A two-port network is said to be reciprocal if AD minus BC is equals to 1. Thank you for watching this video.